There are places in this world that once stood as beacons of human achievement, centers of knowledge so profound that scholars traveled for months, even years, just to stand within their walls. And then, quietly, almost without notice, they disappeared from history, not destroyed in a single dramatic moment, not burned in one catastrophic night, but erased slowly, methodically, until even their memory became uncertain. Tonight, I'd like to take you to one of these places, the Library of Alexandria. Perhaps you've heard the name. Perhaps you remember learning about it decades ago in school, or reading about it in a book that stayed with you. For centuries, it has captured our imagination, not just because of what it contained, but because of how it vanished. But here's what makes this story worth exploring again. Almost everything we think we know about what happened to this library may not be entirely accurate. Over the past several decades, historians, archaeologists, and researchers have uncovered documents that paint a very different picture than the one most of us learned. And in doing so, they've revealed something perhaps more unsettling than any single catastrophe. The library didn't die quickly. It died slowly, over centuries, while the world watched. If you enjoy quiet, thoughtful explorations of history's mysteries, stories that reward patience and careful attention, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. I also share additional research materials and questions in the community tab for those who enjoy continuing the journey on their own. Now, let us begin. To understand what happened to the Library of Alexandria, we must first understand what it actually was. And this requires us to set aside some romantic notions and look carefully at the historical record. The library was founded sometime around 295 BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy Isota, though some records suggest it may have been his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus who truly brought it to life. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, ruled Egypt from the magnificent coastal city of Alexandria, a city that was by design meant to be a bridge between Greek and Egyptian civilization. According to the ancient sources that have survived, primarily the writings of Strabo, a geographer who lived around the time of Christ, and various references in letters and documents from antiquity, the library was not simply a building filled with scrolls. It was part of a larger institution called the Mauseon, which translates roughly to museum or house of the muses. Think of it as something closer to a modern research university combined with a think tank. It housed not just texts but scholars, perhaps 100 of them at its peak, who lived, studied, and taught there. They were supported by royal patronage. They paid no taxes. They were given stipends to pursue knowledge for its own sake. This is worth pausing to appreciate. In an ancient world often consumed by conquest and survival, here was an institution dedicated solely to collecting, preserving, and expanding human knowledge. It was, in many ways, an extraordinary gamble on the value of ideas. Now, as to what the library contained, this is where our certainty begins to blur. Ancient sources provide wildly varying estimates. Some suggest 40,000 scrolls, others claim 400,000. A few ambitious accounts push the number to 700,000. Modern historians generally believe the true number probably fell somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 scrolls at the library's peak, which would have occurred sometime in the 3rd or early 2nd century BCE. But we must remember a scroll in this context was not equivalent to a modern book. A single work, say Homer's Iliad, might require multiple scrolls, and not every scroll contained a unique text. The library housed multiple copies of popular works, translations in different languages, and commentaries written by various scholars. According to tradition, the Ptolemaic rulers were obsessed with acquiring texts. Ships that docked in Alexandria's harbor were searched, and any books found aboard were confiscated. The library would make copies, keeping the originals and returning the copies to the owners. Whether this actually happened as described, we cannot say with absolute certainty, but the story appears in multiple ancient sources. Scholars worked in the library to establish definitive versions of classical texts. They created the first systematic cataloging system, compiled by a poet and scholar named Callimachus. They translated Hebrew scriptures into Greek, producing what we now call the Septuagint. They preserved works of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy that might otherwise have been lost. The Earth's circumference worked there. Euclid may have taught there. Archimedes studied there. It was, without exaggeration, one of the intellectual centers of the ancient world, which makes what happened next all the more puzzling. Because the library, this remarkable institution, did not survive. By the time the Islamic armies arrived in Alexandria in 641 CE, roughly 9 centuries after its founding, the great library was already gone. What remained, if anything, was a shadow. The question that has haunted historians for centuries is simple to ask, but extraordinarily difficult to answer. What happened? When did it happen? And who, if anyone, was responsible? To find the answer, we need to examine not one catastrophe but several, and we need to be willing to question stories that have been repeated for so long they've taken on the weight of fact. If you were to ask most people who destroyed the Library of Alexandria, many would immediately answer, Julius Caesar. This story has been told so many times in so many books and documentaries that it has become almost canonical. But when we examine the historical sources carefully, the actual documents written by people who were alive at the time or shortly after, the picture becomes considerably more complex. Let us begin with what we know happened. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey the Great during the Roman Civil War. Pompey was assassinated upon arrival by the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII's advisors, who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. But Egypt at this time was itself embroiled in a bitter succession struggle between Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife Cleopatra VII. Caesar, perhaps unwisely, decided to involve himself in this dispute, taking Cleopatra's side. This decision led to what historians call the Alexandrian War. Caesar, with a relatively small force, found himself besieged in the royal quarter of Alexandria. Egyptian forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII controlled much of the city and threatened to capture or destroy Caesar's fleet in the harbor. According to Caesar's own account found in his work The Civil War, he ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships in the harbor to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The fire spread. Buildings near the waterfront burned. Here is where our first question arises. Several ancient writers, including Seneca the Younger, Plutarch, and Dio Cassius, mention that books were destroyed in this fire. Seneca, writing about a century after the event, states that 40,000 books burned. But, and this is crucial, none of these sources explicitly state that the great library itself was destroyed. Modern archaeological research and analysis of ancient sources suggests the main library, the Mausoleum, was located inland from the harbor in the royal quarter, but not directly on the waterfront. What likely burned were books stored in warehouses near the docks, possibly waiting to be shipped or recently arrived. We have records of scholars working at the library decades after Caesar's fire. Strabo, the geographer I mentioned earlier, visited Alexandria around 25 BCE, more than 20 years after Caesar's intervention, and describes the library as still functioning. He doesn't mention any catastrophic destruction. This doesn't mean Caesar's fire had no impact. The destruction of 40,000 scrolls, if that number is even approximately accurate, would have been a significant loss. But it appears not to have been the death blow to the institution itself. So we must ask, if Caesar didn't destroy the library, why has this story persisted for so long? Part of the answer may lie in how stories are told and retold. Caesar was, after all, assassinated just 4 years after the Alexandrian War. He became one of history's most famous figures. Cleopatra's story became legendary, and legends, as they're passed down through centuries, tend to simplify complex events into clear moral narratives. By the medieval period, the story of Caesar burning the great library had become firmly established in the popular imagination. It was repeated by chroniclers who had never seen the original sources. It was embellished with dramatic details, and eventually it became the accepted version of events. But history, when we examine it carefully, is rarely so neat. The truth is often more subtle, more gradual, and less satisfying as a simple story. Which brings us to the second suspect in our investigation, a figure far less known to the general public, but who may have played a more significant role in the library's decline. By the late 3rd century CE, more than 300 years after Caesar's fire, Alexandria had changed dramatically. The Ptolemaic dynasty was long gone, replaced by direct Roman rule, but more significantly, the religious landscape of the Mediterranean world was undergoing a profound transformation. Christianity, which had begun as a small Jewish sect in the early 1st century, was now spreading rapidly throughout the Roman Empire, and nowhere was the conflict between the new faith and the old pagan traditions more intense than in Alexandria. To understand what happened to the library, we need to understand that by this time, Alexandria had become a major center of Christian theology. The catechetical school of Alexandria, founded in the late 2nd century, was one of the earliest Christian institutions of higher learning. Scholars like Clement of Alexandria and Origen studied and taught there, attempting to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian doctrine. But this integration was not universally accepted. Many Christians viewed pagan learning with deep suspicion, seeing it as incompatible with or even hostile to their faith. In 391 CE, something significant happened. The Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree ordering the closure of pagan temples throughout the empire. Christianity was now the official state religion, and the old gods were to be suppressed. In Alexandria, this decree led to violence. A Christian mob, reportedly led by the Patriarch Theophilus, attacked the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapeus, which housed what some historians believe was a daughter library or branch collection of the Mausian. The historical sources for this event come primarily from Christian and pagan writers of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, and they tell quite different stories. Christian sources, like the church historian Socrates Scholasticus, portray the destruction of the Serapeum as a justified response to pagan resistance. Pagan sources describe it as wanton destruction of ancient learning. What we can say with reasonable confidence, based on archaeological evidence and multiple written accounts, is that the Serapeum was indeed destroyed in 391 CE, and that it did contain a significant collection of books. Whether this was formally part of the Library of Alexandria or a separate collection is debated among scholars. But there's another event that may have been even more consequential, and it centers around one of history's most tragic figures. In March of 415 CE, a woman named Hypatia was murdered in the streets of Alexandria. Hypatia was a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer, one of the last great scholars associated with the Mausian. She was the daughter of Theon, himself a noted mathematician, who had worked to preserve and comment upon classical Greek mathematical texts, particularly the works of Euclid. According to multiple historical sources, including the church historians Socrates Scholasticus and John of Nicaea, Hypatia was highly respected in Alexandria. She taught philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism, to students who came from across the Mediterranean. She corresponded with other scholars. She may have held a formal teaching position, possibly the only woman known to have done so in antiquity. She was also, significantly, not a Christian. The accounts of her death are disturbing. During the Lenten season of 415, she was attacked by a mob of Christian parabolani, a group that functioned as something between paramedics and enforcers for the Patriarch of Alexandria, Cyril. She was dragged from her chariot, stripped and killed. The motivations behind her murder remain debated. Some sources suggest it was primarily a political assassination. Hypatia was close to Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who was engaged in a bitter power struggle with Patriarch Cyril. Others suggest her prominence as a pagan philosopher in an increasingly Christian city made her a target for religious zealots. What we cannot say with certainty is whether her death was directly connected to any systematic destruction of the library. Some historians argue that by 415, the Mausian as a functioning institution was already largely defunct. Others believe Hypatia's murder represented the final blow to Alexandria's pagan intellectual tradition, of which the library was the symbol and center. What we can say is this. By the early 5th century, the conditions that had sustained the library for 7 centuries, royal patronage, intellectual freedom, respect for learning regardless of religious tradition, no longer existed in Alexandria. The city was divided by religious conflict. Imperial resources were stretched thin. The economy was declining, and increasingly, pagan learning was viewed not as a treasure to be preserved, but as a threat to be suppressed. In this environment, even if the library's buildings still stood, even if some scrolls remained on shelves, the institution as a living center of scholarship could not survive. But there is one more suspect in this investigation, one more event that has been blamed for the library's destruction, and this one has generated perhaps more controversy than any other. In the year 641 CE, approximately 2¼ centuries after Hypatia's death, Arab armies under the command of Amir ibn al-Ez conquered Alexandria. Egypt, which had been part of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, now became part of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. And according to one account, written more than 5 centuries after the conquest, this is when the Library of Alexandria finally met its end. But before we examine this claim, we need to understand something about historical sources. The further removed a writer is from the events they describe, the more skeptical we must be of their account, especially when earlier sources make no mention of the same events. The story of the Arabs destroying the library appears in a work called The History of the Wise Men, written by a Christian scholar named Bar Hebraeus, who lived in the 13th century, more than 600 years after the conquest. According to Bar Hebraeus's account, a scholar named John Philoponus asked the conquering general, Amir ibn al-Ez, to spare the books of the library. Amir, in turn, sought guidance from the Caliph Umar in Medina. Umar reportedly replied with words that have echoed through history, "If these books are in agreement with the Quran, we have no need of them, and if they are opposed to the Quran, destroy them." The books, according to this account, were then distributed to the city's bathhouses to be used as fuel for heating water, and it took 6 months to burn them all. Now, this is a dramatic story. It provides a clear villain, a definitive ending, and a moral about religious intolerance. It has been repeated in countless books and articles over the centuries. But modern historians have identified several significant problems with this account. First, Bar Hebraeus was writing 600 years after the events he describes. He was not citing any earlier source, no contemporary account of the Islamic conquest of Alexandria, not from Christian Byzantine historians, not from Islamic historians writing shortly after the conquest, mentions the destruction of any library. We have detailed accounts of the conquest from both Islamic and Christian sources written within a century of the event. None of them mention books or libraries being burned. Second, John Philoponus, the scholar who supposedly appealed to Emma, was indeed a real person and a notable philosopher, but he appears to have died sometime in the late 6th century, nearly 50 years before the Islamic conquest. He could not have been in Alexandria in 641. Third, the story attributes to Caliph Umar an attitude toward non-Islamic learning that seems inconsistent with other documented Islamic practices of the period. We have substantial evidence that early Islamic scholars actively sought out and translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts. The Great Translation movement in Baghdad, just a century and a half later, was built on preserving and studying exactly the kind of classical learning the library would have contained. Now, this doesn't mean the Islamic conquest had no effect on Alexandria or its intellectual life. Conquest, by its nature, disrupts institutions. Patronage networks collapse. Scholars flee or are killed. Resources are redirected. But the specific story of the Arabs systematically burning the library's collection appears, based on our current evidence, to be a later fabrication, possibly created during the Crusades, when Christian Europe and the Islamic world were in conflict, and stories that portrayed Muslims as destroyers of learning served political purposes. Most historians today believe that by 641, there was no longer any significant library collection to destroy. The institution had already declined over the preceding centuries. What the Arab conquerors found in Alexandria was a city that had been in economic and intellectual decline for generations. So we are left with a puzzle. If no single catastrophe destroyed the library, if Caesar didn't burn it, if the Christian mobs didn't definitively destroy it, if the Arabs didn't use its books as fuel, then what actually happened? To answer this, we need to shift our thinking. We need to stop looking for a dramatic moment of destruction and start examining something harder to see: gradual, incremental decline over centuries. The Library of Alexandria did not die in a fire. It died the way most institutions die, slowly, quietly, from a combination of factors that compounded over time until nothing remained but memory. This is a harder story to tell than the dramatic alternatives. It doesn't give us a villain to blame or a specific tragedy to mourn, but it is, based on our current understanding of the evidence, almost certainly the truth. Let us walk through the centuries and see how this happened. The library reached its peak sometime in the 3rd century BCE, probably during the reign of Ptolemy III. At this point, it had strong royal patronage, ample resources, and Alexandria was the unrivaled center of Greek learning in the Mediterranean. But already, by the late 2nd century BCE, we can see signs of trouble. The Ptolemaic dynasty was weakening. Royal patronage became less reliable. Palace intrigues and succession crises diverted resources away from scholarly pursuits. We have a vivid account from Galen, a physician writing in the 2nd century CE, about what happened to the library's collection during this period. He describes how Ptolemy VIII, in a political purge around 145 BCE, expelled scholars and intellectuals from Alexandria. Many fled to other cities, taking knowledge and perhaps books with them. The brain drain weakened the institution significantly. By the time Rome effectively took control of Egypt in 30 BCE, following the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra, the library was no longer the preeminent center of learning it had once been. Roman patronage helped maintain it for a time, but Rome had other libraries, other priorities. Alexandria remained prosperous through the early Roman period, but by the 3rd century CE, the entire Mediterranean world was experiencing crisis. The Roman Empire was fragmenting. Economic disruptions, military chaos, and plague decimated populations and destroyed trade networks. Libraries, fundamentally, are expensive. They require constant investment, not just in acquiring texts but in preserving them. Papyrus degrades rapidly in any environment with moisture. Scrolls must be recopied regularly, or they simply disintegrate. Professional scribes, scholars to curate collections, physical maintenance of buildings, all of this requires sustained funding. When that funding dries up, a library doesn't suddenly disappear. It degrades, texts are not recopied, collections are not organized, buildings fall into disrepair, and slowly, inevitably, the institution becomes a shadow of itself. Here's something most people don't consider. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the Codex, what we would recognize as a book with bound pages, was replacing the scroll as the dominant form of written text. This change was driven partly by Christianity. The Codex format was more practical for religious texts. You could more easily find specific passages, and a single codex could contain all 4 Gospels where scrolls would require 4 separate volumes. But this technological transition meant that old scroll collections were increasingly seen as obsolete. Resources went toward copying important texts into the new format, while less essential scrolls were simply allowed to deteriorate. The Library of Alexandria, built around scroll technology and organized for scroll storage, would have been particularly vulnerable to this transition. We discussed earlier the religious conflicts of the 4th and 5th centuries, but there's a subtler point worth considering. Even without violent destruction, the Christianization of the Roman Empire fundamentally changed which texts were considered valuable. Christian scholars were certainly interested in preserving some classical texts, works of philosophy, rhetoric, and science that could be adapted to Christian purposes. But vast categories of pagan literature, religious texts, poetry celebrating pagan gods, works of divination, were no longer copied, no longer valued. This wasn't necessarily conscious destruction. It was more like cultural triage. In a world with limited resources, copyists prioritized what their society valued, and increasingly, that meant Christian texts and a select core of classical works deemed compatible with Christianity. The irony is that medieval Christian monasteries would eventually become the primary preservers of classical learning, but they preserved only a fraction of what the ancient world had produced. The rest was simply not copied, and when the originals degraded, that knowledge was lost. By the 5th century, even the memory of what the library had been was fading. Scholars still referred to the Library of Alexandria in their writings, but it's increasingly unclear whether they were referring to a still functioning institution or to the legendary library of the past. We can trace this through the sources. Early Byzantine writers speak of the library as if it still exists. Later writers clearly refer to it in the past tense. But the transition is gradual, not abrupt. There's no moment where everyone suddenly acknowledges that the library is gone. This suggests that the decline was so gradual that people living through it might not have fully recognized what was being lost until it was already gone, like watching someone age slowly versus seeing them after years apart. So what really happened to the Library of Alexandria? The answer is less satisfying than any single dramatic event, but more truthful. It declined gradually over roughly 5 centuries, weakened by political instability, economic decline, religious transformation, technological change, and the simple reality that no institution can survive forever without sustained support and purpose. Some books may have burned in Caesar's fire, some may have been destroyed when the Serapeum fell, some may have simply rotted away in neglected rooms. But most likely, the vast majority of the library's collection was simply not recopied, not valued, not saved. Allowed to slowly return to dust as the world that had created it transformed into something new. Now we must ask perhaps the most poignant question of all: what exactly did we lose when the Library of Alexandria declined? This is, by its nature, Impossible to answer completely. We cannot know what we don't know. But we can make educated estimates based on the works that ancient writers reference, but which no longer exist. We know, for instance, that the library contained most or all of the Greek dramatic works from the classical period. Today, we have 7 complete plays by Sophocles. Ancient catalogues indicate he wrote over 120. We have 7 by Aeschylus, of perhaps 90, 18, or 19 by Euripides, of perhaps 95. That means approximately 90% of classical Greek drama is simply gone. The library held extensive works of early philosophy. We have fragments of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Democritus, but only because later writers quoted them. Their actual books, which the library would have held, are lost. Consider what we've lost in science and mathematics. Aristarchus of Samos, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun, 17 centuries before Copernicus. We have only one of his works, preserved through later copies. The rest is gone. Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, wrote extensively on geography, mathematics, and philosophy. Most of his works are lost. We know them only through references in other texts. The library contained medical texts from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. Herophilus, who worked in Alexandria, performed some of the earliest systematic anatomical dissections. His detailed observations of the human body were lost. It would be more than 1,000 years before European medicine would regain that level of anatomical knowledge. But perhaps the most significant loss is one we cannot even catalogue: works from cultures that were largely oral or whose written traditions did not survive through any other route. The library made systematic efforts to acquire texts from across the known world. It held Egyptian texts, both in hieroglyphics and in translation. It held works from Mesopotamia, from Persia, from India. We have scattered references to these collections, but the works themselves are gone. What did the ancient Egyptians understand about architecture, about engineering, about medicine, that died with those texts? What philosophical insights from the East never made it into the Western tradition because the connecting link, the translated texts in Alexandria, was broken? The library represented something rare in human history, a sustained, systematic effort to gather knowledge from diverse cultures and preserve it for future generations. When it declined, we didn't just lose individual books. We lost connections, cross-pollinations of ideas, the potential for discoveries that might have arisen from bringing different traditions into conversation with each other. Now, we should be careful not to romanticize. Some scholars argue that the loss of the Library of Alexandria has been overstated. After all, the most important classical works did survive through copies in other libraries. The texts that were truly essential to later civilizations, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, were preserved. What was lost was primarily the breadth of ancient knowledge rather than its absolute peaks. We have the masterpieces, but we've lost the context, the minor works, the commentaries, the failed experiments, and dead-end theories that help us understand how knowledge actually develops. It's like having only the Nobel Prize-winning papers from the past century of science, without the thousands of other studies that made those breakthroughs possible. We'd understand the conclusions, but we'd have lost the messy human process of how those conclusions were reached. And this brings us to the final question. What does this story mean for us today? The story of the Library of Alexandria is not ultimately about ancient history. It's about a question that every generation must face. What knowledge do we value enough to preserve? And how do we ensure it survives when circumstances change? Today, We live in an age of information abundance that would be incomprehensible to ancient scholars. More information is generated every day than the Library of Alexandria contained in its entire existence. We have digital storage, redundant backups, institutional frameworks for preservation, and yet, the lessons of Alexandria remain relevant. The Library of Alexandria survived for centuries not because of the strength of its buildings or even its collection, but because of sustained institutional support. When that support weakened, when patronage became uncertain, when priorities shifted, when resources grew scarce, the institution could not sustain itself. We see this today: libraries, museums, archives. These institutions always operate on uncertain footing. They're often among the first to face budget cuts because their value is harder to quantify than immediately practical concerns. The justification for their existence must be made repeatedly, to each new generation of administrators and politicians. And like Alexandria, the decline is rarely dramatic. It happens gradually. Positions go unfilled. Climate control systems aren't upgraded, digitization projects are delayed, acquisition budgets shrink. By the time the crisis becomes visible, years of cumulative damage have already occurred. We discussed how the shift from scroll to codex left the Library of Alexandria vulnerable. Today, we're experiencing our own technological transitions that are happening far more rapidly than in the ancient world. Digital formats become obsolete within decades, sometimes years. How many of us still have easy access to data stored on floppy disks or even early hard drives? The software needed to read certain file formats no longer exists or no longer runs on modern computers. Archivists call this digital decay. Unlike physical books, which can survive for centuries if properly stored, digital information requires constant active maintenance, migration to new formats, new storage media, new systems. Stop that maintenance, and the data becomes inaccessible far faster than papyrus crumbles. We assume that because we've digitized something, we've preserved it forever. But digital preservation requires sustained institutional commitment just as much as physical preservation did in Alexandria. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is about what gets preserved when choices must be made. In Alexandria's decline, texts that aligned with the dominant religious and cultural values of the time were more likely to be copied, preserved, and transmitted to future generations. Texts that didn't, regardless of their intrinsic value, were allowed to fade. Today, we digitize what seems important to us now. We preserve languages, literatures, and knowledge systems that align with current academic and cultural priorities. But what are we allowing to slip away? What folk knowledge, what minority languages, what alternative ways of understanding the world are disappearing because they don't fit our current frameworks of value? There are approximately 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. Linguists estimate that half of them will disappear by the end of this century. With each language goes not just words, but entire ways of understanding the world, traditional ecological knowledge, oral histories, philosophical perspectives that may have no equivalent in dominant languages. This is Alexandria's loss playing out again, in slow motion, on a global scale. The Library of Alexandria was designed to be comprehensive, to gather all the world's knowledge in one place. This was its great strength and its great vulnerability. When that single repository declined, vast amounts of knowledge that existed nowhere else was lost. Today, we understand the importance of redundancy. Major libraries coordinate preservation efforts. Digital archives maintain multiple copies in geographically distributed locations. But we're also seeing new forms of centralization. Increasingly, our collective knowledge is held by a small number of technology companies. Search engines mediate our access to information. Social media platforms control which ideas circulate and which disappear. What happens when these platforms change their priorities, alter their algorithms, or simply cease to exist? What 21st century knowledge might be as lost to future historians as the plays of Sophocles are to us? The Library of Alexandria thrived when it had a clear purpose to serve the intellectual ambitions of the Ptolemaic dynasty and to establish Alexandria as a center of learning. When that purpose became unclear, when new rulers had different priorities, when religious transformation changed the definition of valuable knowledge, the institution lost its animating vision. Today, we must continually ask, why do we preserve? Not just how, but why. Is it simply to store information, or to make it accessible? To preserve it exactly as it was, or to make it relevant to new audiences? To serve scholars, or to serve the public? These questions have no single correct answer, but they must be asked, because purpose is what sustains institutions through difficult times. When resources are scarce, when priorities compete, only a clear sense of purpose can justify the continued investment preservation requires. The story of the Library of Alexandria, then, is not really about what we lost 2,000 years ago. It's about what we're losing right now, and what we might lose in the future if we don't learn from history. It's about understanding that preservation is not passive. It's not something that simply happens. It requires conscious choice, sustained effort, and a willingness to invest in things whose value may not be immediately apparent. Because the lesson of Alexandria is ultimately this: knowledge doesn't disappear in dramatic conflagrations. It slips away quietly, one unmade choice at a time, while we're focused on other things. We began this journey by asking what really happened to the Library of Alexandria. We've traced the evidence, examined the suspects, and considered the slow accumulation of factors that led to its decline. But perhaps the more important question is this: what happens to libraries, to repositories of knowledge, to institutions of learning, when civilizations lose sight of why they matter? The scholars who worked in Alexandria during its golden age could not have imagined that their institution would someday cease to exist. They were surrounded by scrolls, by other learned people, by the apparent permanence of scholarship. And yet, within a few generations, the conditions that sustained their work had eroded. Today we have institutions of remarkable depth and breadth. We have technological tools for preservation that would seem miraculous to ancient scholars. We have international cooperation, professional standards, and a growing understanding of how to safeguard knowledge for future generations. But we also have all the same vulnerabilities: political instability, economic uncertainty, technological disruption, cultural transformation. And we have the same dangerous tendency to assume that what exists today will naturally continue to exist tomorrow. The Library of Alexandria didn't fall to barbarians or fanatics. It didn't burn in a single catastrophic fire. It declined because gradually, over time, sustaining it became less important than other concerns. This can happen to any institution. It can happen to our libraries, our museums, our archives. It can happen to entire fields of knowledge, entire ways of understanding the world. But awareness is the first step toward prevention. Understanding how Alexandria was lost helps us see the warning signs in our own time. It reminds us that preservation is an active choice, not a passive state. Every time we choose to fund a library, instead of closing it, to digitize a collection instead of letting it decay, to learn a disappearing language instead of letting it fade, to pass on knowledge instead of assuming someone else will, we're making the choice Alexandria's later generations failed to make. Perhaps that's the real lesson. Not that loss is inevitable, but that preservation requires conscious, repeated commitment from each generation. The Library of Alexandria is gone. We cannot bring it back. We cannot recover what was lost. But we can decide, here and now, that we will not allow the same gradual, quiet disappearance to happen to the knowledge we've been entrusted to preserve. That choice, made every day by archivists and librarians and ordinary people who believe the past matters, is how we answer the question of what happened to Alexandria. Not by mourning what was lost, but by protecting what remains. Thank you for taking this journey with me. I hope it's given you something to think about, not just about ancient history, but about the choices we face today regarding what we preserve and why. If you found value in this exploration, I invite you to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to careful, thoughtful examinations of history's quieter mysteries, the stories that reward patience and attention. I also maintain a community tab where I share additional research materials, document sources, and questions for further reflection. Many of you have told me you enjoy continuing the research on your own, and I try to provide resources that make that possible. If you have thoughts about this topic, questions, insights, or your own reflections on preservation and loss, I'd genuinely be interested to read them in the comments below. Until our next exploration, take care. And perhaps if you have a moment, visit your local library. These institutions matter more than we often remember.